Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new video, and today we're going to be doing another what if. We're going to be doing what if Robert Lincoln was elected in the 1884 presidential election. Robert Lincoln is the son of Abraham Lincoln, as some of you might know. In our own timeline, Robert Lincoln did not run for president. He was pushed to run, however he declined either the presidential or nor the vice president nomination. He was offered both and he really didn't want either. So it's become a what if scenario throughout time, and we're going to be taking a look at that today. Started off in 1884, pretty standard election. Robert Lincoln running against Grover Cleveland. Lincoln would win this election, defeating Grover Cleveland 219 to 182 to become the 22nd president. Robert Lincoln's running mate would be James Blaine, the senator from Maine. And Lincoln would, sorry about that, but Robert Lincoln, who was the Secretary of War, would be elected the 22nd president. And during this term, it really wouldn't be all that eventful. However, trade would be a bit better, which would equate to the economy being a little bit better. Of course, there would be a lot less of a Chinese discrimination coming from the federal government. Instead, Lincoln would try to push for some form of uh, Civil Rights Act for Chinese folk coming into the country. There would be no immigration tax, as Cleveland did in his term. Going on in 1888, the Democrats would nominate the governor of Ohio, Allen Thurman, um, as you know, Blaine would go on to defeat Thurman. Of course, the economy's good and all that. However, Chinese civil rights would be a pretty large issue this election cycle. However, it'd be an issue that we wouldn't remember today. But in Lincoln's second term, the biggest thing he'd get a note done was a civil rights bill that would bar Chinese discrimination. However, it would be remembered as a failed Civil Rights Act because it really didn't do anything to accomplish said uh, banning of Chinese discrimination. Lincoln would be remembered as someone who didn't enforce it enough, like Lincoln enforced the Civil Rights Act during his time, the Lincoln before him. Going on to the 1892 election, the Democrats would nominate New York Senator David Hill. The Republicans nominate Vice President James Blaine. And of course, we have the populist Congressman James Weaver from Iowa. And Weaver would be taking votes away from both parties. However, there's a bit of a party fatigue from the Republicans, so David Hill barely gets by, defeating Blaine and Weaver 229 to 179 to 36 to become the 23rd president. And David Hill wouldn't have that great of a term. He, around the first few months of his administration, the country would head into a recession, and it would make the Hill administration look really bad, and thus his approval tanks. And no surprise, in 1896, the Republicans nominating the governor of Ohio, William McKinley, would go on to beat David Hill 295 to 152. Garrett Hobart being McKinley's running mate here. McKinley's term here would be the exact same as it was IRL. It would be it would be his first term. It'd be the same as IRL. Going on to 1900, it'd be a pretty much very similar rendition of the election that happened in 1900 in our timeline, except William Bryan would do a lot better considering this is his first time running for president instead of the second time, or first time being the Democrat nominee. But McKinley would beat Bryan by a much narrower margin than it was in real life. McKinley would defeat Bryan 274 to 173. Same stuff happens in this term as it did IRL. McKinley is still assassinated, and thus Theodore Roosevelt would become president, and we'd have another repeat of the 1904 election. Alton Parker would get crushed by Theodore Roosevelt 336 to 140, and he would be elected to a full term. And again, there's no change from Roosevelt's time as president in our timeline as here in this timeline. In 1908, the Democrats would nominate William Bryan for the second time, and of course he would do a lot better because even though I'm sure Taft would try the whole vote for me now, you can vote for Taft or Bryan anytime, it really wouldn't be as effective considering he's only ran one other time, or was a nominee one other time, and now he's running again, doing a lot better than he did in 1908. He would actually go on to narrowly, or would defeat William Taft 275 to 208 to become the 26th president. And of course, the gold standard would be dropped in terms of her. Hold on. Last time I made this mistake. Give me a second. Okay, I was correct. I didn't want to get yelled at again because last time I did this, I got yelled at by y'all. William Bryan would get rid of the gold standard in replacement of free silver, which at first doesn't have any negative effects. It actually does boost the economy. very well. We probably see a bunch of progressive amendments, such as the direct election of senators, a bunch of amendments that we saw during the progressive movement from names such as Roosevelt and Bryan that we would see during this term. It'd be a very successful term, but we talk about the negative effects of free silver down the road. In 1912, William Bryan would be running against Albert Cummins, or Cummins, I don't know how to pronounce that. I think he is the senator from Iowa, I could be wrong. But Bryan would defeat Cummins, not because Cummins was a bad candidate, it's just because Bryan was just so popular. Sorry about that, the dog just doesn't want to stop barking. But William Bryan, just because he's so popular, would defeat Albert Cummins. He's just popular with the people of the United States, so he would be reelected by a landslide margin. And in this term, we'd see a lot of, so we'd see a lot of what Roosevelt campaigned on. We'd probably see recall elections be nationalized to where, senators, congressfolk, governors could be recalled. We'd probably see a lot more nationwide referendums in the midterms than we do now, which we don't see any, so that would probably be a normal thing instead of states, pushing for it. It would be a nationwide thing where I guess you could say Congress could initiate a nationwide referendum that would happen during the midterms. Whether or not that would be successful, considering midterms are always benefit to the party opposite of the incumbent party. I don't know. It might help because it would incentivize the incumbent party turnout. So there is that. So it would just be continuation of progressive policies. We would probably not have gone into World War One, which would result in World War One going into a stalemate. Hitler would never rise to power, and World War Two would never occur. Going on to 1916, the Republicans would nominate the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, I believe, Charles Evans Hughes, after both parties had a pretty stacked primary, and the Democrats would nominate a new senator from New Jersey. Woodrow Wilson would become a senator in his time from, Bryan's term. He would become a senator. He'd be a one-term senator, most likely about to be elected to a second term, or has already been elected to a second term. He would go up against Woodrow Wilson, who would be very, very unpopular. He would not be seen as the successor to William Bryan. Bryan would even go out in support of Charles Hughes. Wilson wouldn't be able to turn out Democrats, and Hughes would most likely defeat Wilson 339 to 192 to become the 27th president. And during Hughes' term, we'd probably see a lot of good benefits for the economy. We'd probably see such as tax cuts, probably a bunch of initiation or a bunch of legislation to initiate free markets during his first term. It'd be a term mostly focused on the economy, maybe the military here and there, boost that a little bit. Going on to 1920, the Democrats would nominate a much better candidate, at this time in James Cox, who would be able to, bring out more of these progressive voters that Woodrow Wilson could not have done. However, again, it's James Cox. He ran a terrible campaign. Beforehand, the economy's doing amazing. It's really an uphill battle. Charles Hughes, even though does worse, which he would become the first president to do worse the second time around. However, he would still beat James Cox 318 to 213 to win re-election. And in this time, we'd more probably see a crash in the economy. Nothing too bad, probably like a recession of some sorts. It'd be a very small time recession. However, it's still bad enough to the point where, the Democrats get a huge boost heading into the 1924 election. However, free silver is not the, suspect quite yet. However, in 1924, the Democrats nominate the brother of William Bryan, the governor of Nebraska, Charles Bryan, while the Republicans nominate the governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge. And of course, we see a progressive senator out of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, who's pretty much taking votes away from both parties, as of course Coolidge is seen as the economic conservative social progressive wing, while Bryan is the full-blown progressive wing of the Democrat Party, kind of grassroots populist progressive. But Charles Bryan would still go on to defeat Calvin Coolidge 281, 237, 213, as of course La Follette wins his home state of Wisconsin. He becomes the 28th president. Charles Bryan would, of course, get the economy back good and running. However, historians would look back on this time as saying the economy could have been a lot better. However, due to the fact that the economy did take quite a bit of a dip during Hughes's last term. It would be like, hey, it was better than it was 4 years ago, so Charles Bryan like, hey, you did a good job. That would be the consensus here. Charles Bryan would continue progressive policies. We'd probably see women get the right to vote here in 1924, which would be late, however, it still occurs. I currently can't think of anything else Bryan would have done at this point. But we go on to the 1928 election, as we are now seeing Herbert Hoover, the Republican secretary from the Hughes administration, the Secretary of Commerce, now running against Bryan. And of course, like I said, people think the economy is doing great, even though, as historians would note, it could have been better. Bryan defeats Hoover by a massive margin, 445 to 86, to win re-election. Hoover just getting destroyed, even though Hoover would not really be that bad of a candidate. It's just, he's actually probably the best candidate out of everybody running here, besides Charles Curtis, but that's besides the point. But as we know the story here, the Great Depression occurs, the economy fucking crashes, and Republicans are running on getting rid of free silver, attacking that for the high inflation that's been happening since free silver was instituted. Inflation would be a lot higher. It'd be about 6 points higher than it was IRL. The economy would be worse. Businesses would shut down quicker. Bryan probably would have done better than Hoover, but of course he would probably a lot more government interference, which could backfire against Bryan and the Democrats. But the Republicans nominate Maryland Senator Joseph Frantz, and the Democrats nominate New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt. However, since the Democrats are hated at this point, Frantz would destroy Franklin Roosevelt, Roosevelt only winning the states of Mississippi and South Carolina, Frantz winning 514 to 17 to become the 29th president. And Frantz would take a step back from, government interference. It'd still be quite a bit from Frantz. This is from the Frantz administration. However, it'd be a lot more laissez-faire than the Bryan administration was. And we can see it would be slow. It'd be a lot slower than the Franklin Roosevelt administration, IRL. But the economy slowly gets better and better. And heading into 1936, the Democrats nominate Henry Breckinridge, who was the Secretary of War under the Bryan administration. And Breckinridge does a bit better. He flips Louisiana, but still gets crushed. France winning re-election to a second term. And again, we'd see, more laissez-faire capitalism working here. Of course, it would be like that thing where France didn't get us out of the Depression. He helped us get through it. It would be like that, but France would win re-election. He would not seek a third term. However, we'd see a rise of paleoconservatism occur in the Republican Party with Robert Taft, who would be running a grassroots campaign, a very conservative campaign, against the Democrats' William Bankhead, who run a very more conservative campaign, try to get away from progressivism. And Taft would still defeat Bankhead by a pretty large margin to become the 30th president, most because that the stigma against Democrats are still there. The public really doesn't trust Democrats still after the whole free silver thing. Now they're back at the gold standard. With Taft, we'd probably see a huge focus on getting busing immigrants out of the country, as Taft supported the whole Hoover deported more immigrants than any other president in history during the Great Depression, and we'd probably see something very similar with Taft during this time. And it really wouldn't help the economy at all. It's kind of iffy with immigration and the economy. It's like sometimes it affects it, sometimes it doesn't. I'm just going to go on the safe side and say it doesn't really affect the economy. We'd see tax cuts, which does get the economy moving a bit, which is a lot more than what France did. But we would get out of the Depression sometime before the 1944 election, and Taft would go on to win re-election, defeating Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, losing Utah, which is interesting, but Taft would defeat Byrd 400 to 131 to win re-election. And Taft would decline to seek a third term. Instead, his vice president, Thomas Dewey, would be nominated by the Republicans. And the Democrats would nominate the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond. And Dewey would go on to beat Thurmond because Thurmond's a, segregationist. probably much high on the segregation issue. Probably put less funding into areas that allow blacks to be integrated into society. It wouldn't do well. He'd probably get crushed with white working class voters. He'd do very well in the South, but that's about it. But Dewey would go on to defeat Thurman because Thurman's just a terrible candidate, and that's just pretty much how politics back then worked. Dewey defeats Thurman 364 to 267 to become the 31st president. Uh, and here, we'd probably see like Cold War tensions occur, probably from like all sides because Russia is now getting to the point where it's starting to pull like Germany back into World War II in our timeline. So a Cold War does occur. It's just not the same Cold War we imagine today. Probably a lot more wars are fought, and Dewey would fight in one of these hypothetical wars. Probably a war for Poland, I guess, as Russia invades Poland this time. That's what I'm imagining. It wouldn't result in a world war per se. It would just be a regional war in Poland where Dewey would, you know, seek both a lot of praise and criticism for his handling of a Poland war. And going in 1952, the Democrats nominate Oklahoma Senator Robert Kerr. This whole election is based off of this war in Poland, where Dewey would go on to defeat Kerr 361 to 170. The country is very patriotic when we get into a war. The incumbent usually benefits from something like that, but Dewey would win, and most of this time in 1952 would be focused on, this Poland War. In 1956, Earl Warren would be nominated by the Republicans, the current vice president, and the Democrats would nominate Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, who is a lot more progressive than the previous candidates or the previous nominees the Democrats have put up. Earl Warren would go on to beat him, but it'd be the closest election in a long time for Democrats. But during this time, we would get out of the we'd get out of Poland, proceed to get into Korea, and then proceed to get out of Korea. So it's another Republican term of just dealing with wars. Warren wouldn't be able to deal with any social issues. It'd be focused on both the economy as well as foreign policy. So it'd be very uneventful, just dealing with all that. Going on to 1960, Earl Warren would be running for re-election, and the Democrats nominate Missouri Senator Stuart Symington, who, again, very progressive compared to other candidates, but still has that Southern charm about him. And Stuart Symington would go on to defeat Earl Warren. Of course, the economy, we would see a post-war recession, double that because we just got out of both Poland and Korea. It'd be a lot worse. And Symington would go on to defeat Earl Warren, having it become the first one-term president. God, who was the last one-term president, I wonder? I have no idea. It'd be long before Lincoln. It'd be years since we had a one-term president beforehand. I want to say Rutherford Hayes would have been the last one-term president, but Earl Warren would become the first one-term president since Hayes, this time not by his choosing, but because he lost an election. And in Symington's time, we'd probably see a big push for civil rights. We probably would have gotten a Equal Pay Act passed as well. We would have gotten civil rights legislation passed. A bunch of social policies would have been passed. We probably see a lot of social welfare as well. A big shift from foreign policy and economic policy to just straight social policy here. Symington would probably alienate a lot of Southern voters, which would be a big issue in the 1964 election, where the Republicans would nominate Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. And unlike in our timeline where Goldwater was seen as far right, paleoconservatism and just libertarianism in general would be seen as the norm thanks to Robert Taft and any Republican president afterwards, Dewey, Warren, who would be to the right of where they were in our timeline. Goldwater would do a lot better. He'd do very well in the South because Symington, due to his big push for civil rights, would alienate those voters. However, Symington would still beat Goldwater 409 to 129. Just things are doing well. The economy's doing great. People have a bunch of social welfare that they can just sit on. So Symington would be reelected to a second term. And in this time, Symington would just be we would get into the Vietnam War, which would kind of, drop Symington's approval amongst the public because he would campaign on not getting us in the wars, considering Dewey and Warren had got us into two back-to-back wars, Poland and Korea. We got this Cold War with Russia and China. People just are a lot more isolationist, but the government's more interventionist, which is kind of how it is today in our timeline, where the government's very interventionist, but the American people are just want to be left alone, isolationist. But going in the 1968 election, JFK, the vice president who was never assassinated in our timeline because there was no need, would be running against the governor of California, Ronald Reagan. And it would be a very close election. Kennedy would defeat Ronald Reagan 318 to 220, mostly because the war issue. Kennedy would be seen as a dovish candidate, and that's what the people wanted, while Reagan was seen as this staunch, hawkish Republican figure. And it would just be very unpopular take. Kennedy would get into office, and we'd honestly probably would have seen a big shift to the left when it comes to welfare policies, and we probably would have gotten some form of universal health care in this country, since John Kennedy would have ran a similar campaign to Robert Kennedy when Robert Kennedy was running on universal health care. So we probably would have seen universal health care established during this Kennedy administration during 1969 to 1973. So universal health care would have been passed successfully, probably though a lot of negotiation, a lot. We would have gotten out of Vietnam eventually. It would be one of those big discussions where Kennedy would have just pulled out, and it would be one of those moments where the right wing of America would be rejuvenated, fired up, and it would be like Kennedy is a traitor, treasonous. We would have won that war if we didn't pull out, and it would just be this huge discussion. Was it worth pulling it out, or should we stay in? It's what many guys ask after they have sex. Should I stay in or pull? Anyway. Going on to 1972, Kennedy, very controversial president, universal health care passed, pulled out of Vietnam. Just pretty even approval ratings. It's just all over the place. And he'd be running against the governor of California, Richard Nixon. And it'd be a very close election, just like 1960 in our timeline. However, it's happening 12 years later. And Kennedy would narrowly defeat Richard Nixon, 270 to 267, just barely pulling ahead. Kennedy winning re-election. And this term would be marked by phenomenal economic growth, considering we have a bunch of welfare, the economy, we're out of war. However, during the end, the October surprise would be that a recession does happen. It always happens after a war. Post-war recession occurs, and going into the 1976 election, the Republicans nominate Kansas Senator Bob Dole, while the Democrats nominate Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. It'd be a very, very close election. The economy being the number one issue. Bob Dole would narrowly win his first term as president, defeating Jimmy Carter. Because, Jimmy Carter's just not that great of a candidate as it is. Bob Dole isn't either, so we just got two pretty abysmal candidates running terrible campaigns who were just likable, but, could be doing better. So Bob Dole does end up winning, becoming president, and in this term, the economy just gets worse. It really doesn't get better. These 4 years under a Dole administration, it would just be marked by a bad economy. Oh, sometimes it goes up, and then it just goes back down again. And then it goes up, and it goes back down. Up again, and back down. And, of course, we would have the energy crises and oil crisis, and it's just not fun. So going on to 1980, the Democrats nominate Mississippi Governor Cliff Finch, who arguably, you could argue, is to the right of Bob Dole socially. However, his economic policies would be that of, say, JFK. So, just, Democrat voters don't know what to do with him, so he nominates a very popular Democrat, John Glenn, as running mate. And, of course, Cliff Finch ends up beating Bob Dole, a very unpopular president, 322 to 216 to become the 36th president. And under Cliff Finch, we'd see economic growth. We'd probably see a ease of tensions between Russia and the U.S. Probably no meeting because the right wing is just would be fired up by a Democrat who, when Democrats are seen as super dovish, it would just be seen as a traitorous move. So Finch would not meet with Russia. So the Cold War would continue on a couple more years than it did in our timeline. But other than that, there's really nothing too important about Finch's first term. Going on to 1984, the Republicans nominate the housing secretary under Bob Dole, Jack Kemp, and of course the Dole administration still isn't popular even 4 years later, and Finch ends up beating Kemp by a somewhat larger margin than we saw 4 years previously. And Finch's second term would just be a continuation of the policies we saw in the first term. Very uneventful. Cliff Finch would be seen as, I guess you could say, Calvin Coolidge is seen today, a pretty good president that didn't do much. Now we go on to the 1988 election, a kind of strange election. The Republicans nominate the Nevada Senator Paul Laxalt, while the Democrats nominate Tennessee Senator Al Gore, and Laxalt would pretty much beat Al Gore. It'd be like a 2000 election scenario. It'd be super close, and really Laxalt only wins because of party fatigue coming from the Democrats. However, it'd be a blessing in disguise because foreign tensions with Russia would cease, or not cease, but it'd get lessened. Russia and the U.S. would be on better terms than they were under the Fitch administration. We'd probably see tax cuts across the board. I don't want to say we'd see social programs cut. However, social programs aren't as damaging to the economy as they were, as they could be, as Laxalt would run on the potential dangers of social welfare programs damaging the economy. So they wouldn't shrink. However, they'd have a lot more cushion to them, if you know what I mean. We wouldn't see a recession because we just got out of one not that long ago. NAFTA would be a big issue of the next election. Ross Perot would still run. Laxalt supported NAFTA. And the Democrats nominate the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. And Laxalt is just a pretty popular president all around. Laxalt would beat Bill Clinton 287 to 251. Of course, there's Ross Perot winning around 18% of the vote in the background. And in Laxalt's second term, his biggest accomplishment would be getting NAFTA signed and passed. And of course, we all know what NAFTA fucking did to the country. So Laxalt would have that big burden on his back. Heading on to the 1996 election, almost said in 2000, the Democrats nominate the governor of California, or at least the former governor of California, as well as future governor of California. Well, in our timeline. And that would be Jerry Brown. And the Republicans nominate Paul Laxalt's chief of staff, Pat Buchanan. And even though Buchanan's political ideology is the norm nowadays, he himself would just still be seen as far right due to his rhetoric and anti-Semitic comments that he's made. Even if a tenth of those were taken out of context, he still has said some pretty fucked up shit despite that. And it's the fucked up shit that Democrats don't want to focus on. It's weird. But Jerry Brown would defeat the controversial Pat Buchanan 324 to 214 to become the 38th president. And in Jerry Brown's term, we'd probably see assault weapons ban. We probably would have seen what Bill Clinton did in his first term, a big push on assault weapons ban. Probably we'd see a lot of kind of liberal policies. However, it would be similar to where Jerry Brown wants to get something done. It comes back through a lot more moderate. Jerry Brown signs it and he gets a lot of credit for it, making him super popular. Very controversial figure in politics, Jerry Brown would be. But he'd still get quite a bit done. Can't name any off the top of my head. But we now go off to 2000, where the Republicans nominate businessman Steve Forbes, taking Republicans socially to the left, to the center, and Jerry Brown would narrowly defeat Steve Forbes, another president who does worse the second time around, as Steve Forbes does a lot better with white working class voters, as well as moderate voters. But Jerry Brown would defeat Steve Forbes to win another term. And of course, this would be where 9/11 shows up. We'd probably see the Patriot Act signed, probably a lot stronger. Jerry Brown was very, how do I say it without sounding like a douchebag? He wanted the Patriot Act to have a lot more strength to it, which would have a huge rise to foreign libertarianism. We'll get to that here in a second. We would get into Afghanistan. We wouldn't get into Iraq, however, but we head into 2004, where the Republicans nominate Texas Congressman Ron Paul, who is seen as like this hero, this dove hero, as of course the Democrats are now seen as this hawkish party. Ron Paul would fight against the Patriot Act. He would be this national figure, the spokesperson for the American people who think hey, don't you think the Patriot Act's a bit too much? and the Democrats won't listen. And the Democrats decided they wanted to nominate the Secretary of State, John Kerry, who's not that popular himself, and Ron Paul would go on to defeat John Kerry 343 to 194. It'd be a huge hurrah for the Republicans. They can strike down the Patriot Act. We get out of Afghanistan, or actually wouldn't get out of Afghanistan, we'd still be in Afghanistan. Ron Paul would try to get out of Afghanistan, but since we haven't killed Osama bin Laden, it would be a kind of a pointless effort, and it would only make Ron Paul super unpopular since we want to get Osama bin Laden. And of course, the economy would crash due to the Great Recession, and that just makes Ron Paul look pretty bad. And the Democrats would nominate Illinois Senator Barack Obama in 2008, and Obama would crush Ron Paul 358 to 180. Obama doing very well with white working class voters and Southern voters as a whole. As you know, trends are a lot different here. We'd see Ron Paul do better in these libertarian leaning areas like Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, while Obama does better in southern states like South Carolina and Georgia, as well as Missouri. Ron Paul would narrowly carry Florida due to the incumbency factor, but Obama would be elected nonetheless, and his time as president is the same as was IRL, so there's really no point to talk about it. In 2012, Barack Obama would be renominated by the Democrats, and the Republicans would nominate the former senator out of Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum. Santorum would choose Louisiana Governor Buddy Roemer as his running mate, so we have a person from the Rust Belt and South to hopefully pick off some votes away from Obama. But Santorum would still lose to Obama. Obama would win 338 to 200, despite Santorum winning Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana in the process. So again, Obama would still do the things he did IRL. And going on to 2016, the Democrats would nominate Vice President Joe Biden. There's no Hillary, so Biden would jump in to take the nomination for himself. And the Republicans would nominate Texas Senator Ted Cruz. And guess what? The Republicans just continue to have bad luck because they thought that nominating someone as unpopular as Ted Cruz would get the job done, even though unemployment is super high. Joe Biden, no surprise, beats Ted Cruz 311 to 227. Not because that Joe Biden is that good of a candidate. It's because that Ted Cruz is just that bad. As most independent voters want to change from Obama, they just didn't want Ted Cruz. Biden beats Cruz 311, 227 to become the 41st president. And with Biden, it's just a continuation of Obama policies. The TPP is still a thing. The Iran nuclear deal goes through. The ramifications of that, I don't want to talk about, honestly. The unemployment would still be pretty high, probably around 6-7%, if not 8%, until COVID happens. Again, let's talk about a border crisis. Oof, that would happen as well. And of course, COVID happens, the economy crashes, as it did under Trump. It'd just be a lot worse under Biden. And the Democrats nominate Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, the son of former President Ron Paul. And Rand Paul would defeat Joe Biden 285 to 253 to become the 42nd president. And since we don't know all the things that could happen from now until 2024, I'm not going to talk about all that happens under a potential Rand Paul administration. Not quite yet, or just not at this point. But thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This is the Chaotic One saying peace.